Thank you. All right, I'm going to plug in here real quick and, yeah. There we go. I think I can do that and drive from down there. Yeah, this will work. There we go. Hey there, everyone. I'm Aaron Weiss. I'm the Deputy Director of the Center for Western Priorities, based out of Denver. I know... Oh, no. There. We're going to go way back to the beginning here. There we go. You get a preview of this slide deck now. There we go. We've been tracking anti-public lands extremists for the last 7 years. Our first report on this came out actually before Malheur in 2016. The first report was 2015. So we're going to connect the dots between Malheur to January 6th and then look ahead to where these anti-conservation extremists are going. Most of this has already been covered. We will just quickly say we're talking about both the first and second Bundy standoffs here, both in Bunkerville and then again in Burns. And we looked at the political connections between the folks who took over the refuge, the folks who were there at the standoff in Bunkerville, groups like the Oath Keepers, like the 3 Percenters, the Constitutional Sheriffs and Peace Officers Association, and then a bunch of state legislators, including here Michelle Fiore from Nevada, with that lovely pinup calendar there. She sent food and signed pinup calendars to Malheur. She went on to serve on the Las Vegas City Council, I think is running for treasurer of Nevada right now. Matt Shea from Washington went both to Bunkerville and then visited Malheur in 2016. He was actually accused formally of domestic terrorism by the Washington state legislature, refused to resign, but served out his term, is no longer there. Jennifer Fielder there was the CEO of the American Lands Council, which we're going to talk about quite a bit. Yeah.
At the same time, she was the CEO of the Lands Council.
Yep.
She was the head of the House Natural Resources Committee.
Yep. And she was also a member of a group called the Sanders Natural Resource Council, which was founded by white supremacist John Trotchman. And while Jennifer Fielder was running the American Lands Council, ALC took a video from Ammon Bundy directly, chopped Ammon out of it, and shared it on their Facebook page as their own material. That is how tight these groups are with the extremists and the white supremacists. And of course, we have Ken Ivory, who is the OG grifter, if you will. He founded the American Lands Council. He left the Utah State Legislature for a while. He's now back. And he is the one, as you can tell here, who really managed to bridge that gap between the extremists, like InfoWars. There's Alex Jones there. He's on the phone with Glenn Beck talking about Agenda 21 conspiracy theories. And there is Ivory and Jennifer Fielder hanging out with Ted Cruz, and also with the Christian nationalist David Barton, who he wrote what has been called the least credible history book ever written that was so bad even his publisher had to recall it. And then, of course, the Bundys got acquitted. As Eric mentioned, it was a completely botched prosecution, and appeals courts upheld those acquittals. And then Trump pardoned the Hammonds in 2018, and you could tell at that point where things were going. Raul Grijalva, chairman of the Natural Resources Committee in 2018, wrote an op-ed in USA Today warning that this was a blank check to anti-government extremists. And that brings us to January 6th. And it's important to remember that these groups that were there, the Oath Keepers, the 3 Percenters, they fundamentally believe that the Constitution doesn't permit the government to own public land, and they prefer to transfer it either to the states or counties. Again, there's no legal basis for this. It's been tossed out by the Supreme Court over and over and over again. But just like the constitutional sheriffs believe that somehow local sheriffs are the supreme law enforcement authority, the word sheriff doesn't appear in the Constitution, and that hasn't stopped them. So, of course, the Oath Keepers now have been, at least for the moment, sidelined. The leader of the group, Stuart Rhodes, is awaiting seditious conspiracy charges, like big-time, finally, consequences for this. So that is ongoing, and that is, I guess, a bit of good news. But it's important to back up that it was folks like Ammon Bundy who were actively encouraging the Stop the Steal rally. This is from the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights, which is they're a great resource. Look at the date here, November 13th, 1 week after the election, and they saw what Ammon Bundy and his People's Rights Group were doing. They were encouraging folks to head to this March on Washington, and there is Ammon himself showing off one of the resources that people might need in this post-election context. And that brings us to a guy named Trent Loos. Trent is a podcaster, broadcaster, rancher, ostensibly. And here he is on his Facebook live stream with a correspondent named Tom Blumhorst there on the ground on January 6th. 1 day later, Trent Loos, excusing the insurrection, saying, "You come to my house and attempt to violate my rights, my God-given rights, there will be violence." So why are we talking about Trent Loos? Well, here he was 5 years earlier, sitting down at Malheur with Ammon Bundy, giving him a platform. And now jumping forward to 1 week after the insurrection, posting a quote from Lavoy Finicum, who was, of course, killed at Malheur trying to reach into a pocket during the traffic stop. This is not just a little occupation. This is a mass movement involving tens of millions of people. What's that?
LA Tribune portrayed him as a hero.
Yeah, any number of folks portrayed him as a hero. And, we were following him before Malheur. He was posting some batshit crazy stuff on YouTube, so we were not at all surprised when he showed up there and when he was eventually the one who decided to get himself martyred. And he very much is a martyr within this community. And so that brings us to where these folks are going now, and it is an explicit anti-conservation agenda, and they are aiming at 30 by 30. So just a quick recap. 30 by 30 is the initiative to protect 30% of America's lands and waters by the end of the decade. The Biden executive order kicking off this emphasizes strongly voluntary efforts, voluntary partnerships. The EO bends over backwards to emphasize that this is not a land grab, this is about partnerships and collaboration. That has not stopped an organized disinformation campaign emerge within the first month after the EO was signed, and it is being run by a group called American Stewards of Liberty that you're going to want to keep an eye on. This is a report that we put out in April called the 30 by 30 Disinformation Brigade that connects the dots between these extremists and the organized disinformation campaign. American Stewards of Liberty, they're a Texas 501c3. It's run by Margaret Byfield, who is the daughter of Wayne Hage, who Eric mentioned. Wayne Hage, back in the 80s and 90s, ran his cattle illegally, racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars in unpaid grazing fees. Even after he died, his family carried on a fight with the government for years and years over that. Wayne really is a proto-Bundy. And American Stewards basically exists as a financial pass-through for Margaret and her husband Dan. In 2020, which is the most recent year we have their 990s, ASL brought in $200,000 in total revenue. Margaret and Dan paid themselves $190,000 of that. And that brings us back to our buddy Trent Loos, because here April 3rd, less than a month after the executive order, here he is saying we're going to be running hard throughout the Great Plains to educate and empower property rights enthusiasts about how to deal with an overbearing, heavy-handed government. I don't care if you call it 30 by 30, net carbon zero heritage area, or an American Prairie Reserve, which is interesting. If you have worked with the American Prairie Reserve, they really hate the idea of creating room for buffalo. And he goes on from there to just say that conservation was invented by Hitler. It's funny how these Republicans absolutely love Teddy Roosevelt until they don't. That is how far out there Trent Loos is. And there he is 3 days later with Margaret Byfield on his show. This is exactly 3 months after the January 6th insurrection. And here is Margaret showing up. And Margaret and Trent went on a road show mainly across Nebraska, but a bit into Colorado and New Mexico, some other states as well, saying that 30 by 30 was being pushed by the environmental elite based on false science. Byfield agreed with a comment that Trent made comparing 30 by 30 to the Holodomor, which was, of course, the Stalin-led famine that killed 4 million Ukrainians. And that brings us 1 month later to Lauren Boebert, introducing a bill to block the 30 by 30 land grab. And there is tight integration between the folks who backed this bill and who objected to counting the votes of the election. 20 of the 27 co-sponsors voted to not certify the election results. That includes folks like Boebert, Paul Gosar, Andy Biggs, Doug LaMalfa. Gosar, of course, had called the insurrectionists peaceful patriots and wanted a blanket pardon. Biggs was organizing Stop the Steal rallies in Arizona. LaMalfa claimed that the election was fraudulent. You've got some other folks in that same group, Chip Roy, Ronnie Jackson, all backing this anti-30 by 30 bill. I'm not going to dive too much into how this disinformation strategy works other than to hit some of the key points here. They basically run copy and paste resolutions that they take to counties and convince county boards to fill in the blanks and pass a resolution saying we're opposed to 30 by 30. And they just do this by flat out lying about private land and especially conservation easements. These guys really hate conservation easements and the idea that landowners might choose to protect their own land. It is not coincidental that much of this is taking place in Nebraska, which has a law that allows county commissions to block private conservation easements and tell private landowners, no, you may not protect your own land. And then the other thing they do is just invent statistics out of whole cloth. We'll get into some of what they do there. And there is some thinly veiled racism to go along with it. This is an email that American Steward sent out in April, noting correctly that 30 by 30 is wildly popular. 80% of voters support it. It's got broad bipartisan support, but they note only 1 in 4 Americans own land. I don't even know where that number comes from because that isn't accurate from what I can tell. But of course, even that claim is bullshit. Every American owns land. It is, in fact, public land. That's why we're talking about it. And of course, all public land is seized or occupied and unceded indigenous land. American Stewards, unsurprisingly, has nothing to say about indigenous land ownership, knowledge, or management. And of course, it's mind-blowingly racist to suggest that only folks who own land know how to care for the land because you have 200 years of policy to ensure that only white folks own land. Still today, black home ownership rates and indigenous home ownership rates are 25-30% lower than white home ownership rates. They are suggesting here, and this is a really clear dog whistle, that they think only white folks know how to manage the land. So here are some of the players. We talked about Byfield, Luce, Boebert, Gosar. David Bernhardt, former Interior Secretary, showed up at their Stop 30 by 30 summit that happened. Ken Ivory, of course, was also there. Pete Ricketts is the governor of Nebraska. He hosted them. He really hates conservation easements. There's a crazy backstory there involving Deb Fisher, and she was accused of stealing someone's land. Talked to some folks from Nebraska. I can't even follow all of it, but it's wild. And then Gabriella Hoffman, who is basically the mouthpiece for all of this disinformation. She wrote a piece in the Washington Times where she just made up numbers out of whole cloth, claiming that the total amount of the land amounts to 622 million acres. Well, that's just not true. There are 2.4 billion acres of land. I flagged this. I wrote to the Washington Times. Unsurprisingly, the Washington Times was not interested in correcting major errors that underpinned their entire argument. That's just what they do. They make stuff up because the facts aren't on their side. So you have a number of familiar players here amplifying American Stewards' talking points. The oil folks, API, Western Energy Alliance, have all echoed American Stewards' false talking points about 30 by 30, protect the harvest, which we mentioned, funded by Forrest Lucas and was instrumental in the pardon of the Hammonds. CFACT are the ones who employ Gabby Hoffman. Heartland Institute, of course, the original climate deniers. And these folks all showed up at this Stop 30 by 30 summit in Lincoln, Nebraska. I was there. That is, in fact, Ken Ivory sitting right behind me on the plane out there. I can tell you from listening to him talk at his seatmate there for a full hour of that flight, he is every bit as crazy as I make him sound here. I'd never encountered him in person before. Dude is gone. I mean, he is absolutely convinced that there is going to be an Article 5 convention to rewrite the Constitution, and therefore, quote, I am the most dangerous man in America. And even just today, American stewards sent this out. This landed in my inbox. There is no global warming crisis. They just deny basic facts and reality, and they want everyone to go watch the speech from James Taylor, the president of the Heartland Institute, how sweet it is to deny basic climate science. And that's where we're going. We are back now to a group called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that Ken Ivory was always tight with. They are back running op-eds. This is from the Albuquerque Journal last month, claiming we're going to give states public lands so they can manage them better. We went through this 6 years ago. If states had to manage the costs of fighting wildfire on their lands, they would go bankrupt within a year. If states had to manage the cleanup costs of all of the abandoned mines on their land because of the 1872 mining law, they would go bankrupt instantly. There is no way that states, which must balance their budgets, could in fact take over public land management, but they're back arguing this again. So that's where this stands. A couple more resources. We'll toss links in the slide deck, send it around. Our report, accountable.us, has done some great work tracking the anti-conservation movement's ties to domestic terrorism, and the Institute for Research and Education on Human Rights. Go read up on all of that. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.